It is impossible to say when Charles Darrell and Sonia French first decided to murder Sonia's husband Robert. Robert was nearly twice as old as Sonia, and he married her 10 years before Charles Darrell came into her life. For 8 of those years, Sonia was bored with her husband, although he did not seem to realize this. He was more interested in his books and the silver which he bought. Sonia and Charles were lovers for 6 months before things became difficult. People were beginning to talk, and it could not be long before Robert found out about them. Robert will never give me a divorce, thought Sonia, and Charles and I have no money of our own. But Sonia knew that Robert's silver alone was worth enough money to make life very comfortable for her and Charles. By a strange accident, it was a policeman who gave them the idea for their murder plan. The inspector made a surprise visit to the French's house one evening. Charles was also there. He often came in for a drink. There have been several burglaries near here, the inspector told Robert, and we haven't caught the burglar. We know who he is, and it can't be long before we catch him, but we're very worried. He carries a gun, and we're almost sure he has killed a man. Now this house is in a very lonely place. Mr. Darrell is your only neighbor. You also have a lot of valuable silver. What are you trying to say? Asked Robert. I'm saying that it's sensible to be careful, said the inspector. Very careful. Why not put your silver in the bank until the burglar is caught? I don't want to do that, said Robert. The inspector tried not to sound angry. Well, I have warned you, sir, he said. Please remember that. The inspector left, and Charles said the inspector didn't warn me. He knows I've nothing worth stealing. But if this gunman does visit me, he'll be sorry. I have a gun, and I won't think twice before using it. He was tall and strong, and Sonia thought he was very good-looking. And she did not try to hide her feelings. I feel sorry for the burglar who tries to frighten you, Charles, she said. 3 nights later, Sonia was lying awake in her bed. Robert was asleep. It was 10 minutes to 2. Sonia was excited. 10 minutes before Charles enters the house, she thought. It was 10 long minutes. And then she heard a noise. Glass breaking, followed by the sound of a window as it was pushed up. Robert did not wake up. Sonia waited until she heard the sound of Charles climbing through the open window. Then she reached across to Robert's bed. Robert. She was shaking him. Wake up. There's somebody downstairs. Robert woke slowly. What? Someone downstairs. No, I'm sure you're. He sat up in bed, awake now. There is someone. I'll have to go down, I suppose. He put on his old gray dressing gown and went out of the room. Sonia waited in the dark. It seemed a very long wait, but it was less than half a minute. Then a thin line of light appeared under the bedroom door. Sonia heard her husband give a sudden cry. Then she heard a gun explode. Something, or someone heavy, fell to the floor. Then a door was banged open, and there was the sound of running feet outside the house. Sonia waited. She must have time to escape before I called the police, she thought. She put on her bedside light and got out of bed. Now it was all over. She felt strangely calm. She knew what she was going to say to the police. How soon could she marry Charles? 6 months from now. They could go to Venice for a holiday after they were married. She had always wanted to see Venice. Then the door opened, and Robert walked in. For a long moment, Sonia could only look at him, her stomach sick with fear. She looked back at her, silent, white-faced and untidy, but alive. What happened? She said. He got away, said Robert. I'm afraid he's taken some of my best silver with him. I wish now I had listened to the inspector and sent it to the bank. But I heard a gun, said Sonia. I thought You're not hurt, Robert. No, Sonia. I'm not hurt, said Robert. But I have some bad news. It's Charles. I think the dear brave man was watching the house and followed the burglar in to try and help us. She's at the bottom of the stairs. I'm afraid there is nothing that we can do for him. Sonia fell forwards, her eyes closing, and Robert caught her. He carried her to the bed, then went downstairs. When he reached the bottom, he had to step over the body. He did this calmly, stepping around the blood on the carpet. But when he walked into the room where he kept his silver, he wanted to cry. All of the best pieces were gone. He closed the door and went into his study. But before he telephoned the police, he was careful to clean the small gun that was in his dressing gown pocket. Then he locked it inside his desk. He had taken care of the one problem in his usually very tidy life, and he wanted to make sure he would have no more trouble. As the inspector said, it was sensible to be careful. My aunt was a big woman, very tall, with a strong mind and will. She was what you may call a very manly woman. My uncle was a thin, small man, very weak, with no will at all. He was no match for my aunt. From the day of their marriage, he began to grow smaller and weaker. His wife's powerful mind was too much for him. It undermined his health, and very soon he fell ill. My aunt took all possible care of him. Half the doctors in town visited him, and prescribed medicine for him enough to cure a whole hospital. She made him take all the medicines prescribed by the doctors, but all was in vain. My uncle grew worse and worse, and one day she found him dead. My aunt was very much upset by the death of her poor dear husband. Perhaps now she was sorry that she had made him take so much medicine, and felt perhaps that he was the victim of her kindness. Anyhow, she did all that a widow could do to honor his memory. She spent very much money on her mourning dress. She wore a miniature of him about her neck as large as a small clock, and she had a full-length portrait of him, all this hanging in her bedroom. All the world praised her conduct. A woman who did so much to honor the memory of one husband deserves soon to get another, said my aunt's friends. Some time passed, and my aunt decided to move to Derbyshire, where she had a big country house. The house stood in a lonely, wild part of the country among the grey Derbyshire hills. The servants, most of whom came with my aunt from town, did not like the sad-looking old place. They were afraid to walk alone about its half-empty black-looking rooms. My aunt herself seemed to be struck with the lonely appearance of her house. Before she went to bed, therefore, she herself examined the doors and the windows, and locked them with her own hands. Then, she carried the keys from the house, together with a little box of money and jewels, to her own room. She always saw to all things herself. One evening, after she had sent away her maid, she sat by her toilet table, arranging her hair. Or in spite of her sorrow for my uncle, she still cared very much about her appearance. She sat for a little while, looking at her face in the glass, first on one side, then on the other. As she looked, she thought of her old friend, a rich gentleman of the neighborhood, who had visited her that day, and whom she had known since her girlhood. All of a sudden, she thought she heard something move behind her. She looked round quickly, but there was nothing to be seen. Nothing but the painted portrait of her poor dear husband on the wall behind her. She gave a heavy sigh to his memory, as she always did, whenever she spoke of him in company, and went on arranging her hair. Her sigh was re-accorded. She looked round again, but no one was to be seen. "Oh, it is only the wind," she thought, and went on putting her hair in papers. But her eyes were still fixed on her own reflection and the reflection of her husband's portrait in the looking-glass. Suddenly, it seemed to her that in the glass she saw one of the eyes of the portrait move. It gave her a shock. "I must make sure," she thought, and moved the candle so that the light fell on the eye in the glass. Now she was sure that it moved. But not only that, it seemed to give her a wink exactly as her husband used to do when he was living. Now my aunt got really frightened. Her heart began to beat fast. She suddenly remembered all the frightful stories about the ghosts and criminals that she had heard. But her fear soon was over. Next moment, my aunt, who, as I have said, had a remarkably strong will, became calm. She went on arranging her hair. She even sang her favorite song, Nello voice, and did not make a single false note. She again moved the candle, and while moving it, she overturned her workbox. Then she took the candle and began without any hurry to pick up the articles one by one from the floor. She picked up something near the door. Then opened the door, looked for a moment into the corridor as if in doubt whether to go, and then walked quietly out. She hurried down the stairs and ordered the servants to arm themselves with anything they could find. She herself caught up a red-hot poker and, followed by her frightened servants, returned almost at once. They entered the room. Paul was still and exactly in the same order as when she had left it. They approached the portrait of my uncle. "Pulled down that picture," ordered my aunt. A heavy sigh was heard from the portrait. The servant stepped back in fear. "Pulled down at once," cried my aunt impatiently. The picture was pulled down, and from a hiding place behind it, they dragged out a big black bearded fellow with a knife as long as my arm, but trembling with fear from head to foot. He confessed that he had stolen into my aunt's room to get her box of money and jewels when all the house was asleep. He had once been a servant in the house, and before my aunt's arrival had helped to put the house in order. He had noticed the hiding place when the portrait had been put up. In order to see what was going on in the room, he had made a hole in one of the eyes of the portrait. My aunt did not send for the police. She could do very well without them. She liked to take the law into her own hands. She had her own ideas of cleanliness also. She ordered the servants to draw the men through the horse pond in order to wash away his crimes, and then to dry him well with a wooden towel. But though my aunt was a very brave woman, this adventure was too much even for her. She often used to say, "It is most unpleasant for a woman to live alone in the country." Even after, she gave her hand to the rich gentleman of the neighborhood.